as Will mentioned, we're here for your OER Fund evaluation workshop. Again, many congratulations for all of you pursuing this work during these difficult times. We know evaluation is just one more thing to add to your plate, but hopefully this workshop will help guide you in how it can be possible and not too difficult, and offer some of the supports available to you. So for this workshop, what we'd like to focus on or hope that you'll achieve by the end of it is understanding how evaluation can actually increase your project success. So it's not just kind of a means to an end or an end goal that you have to do, but something that you can do along the way that will actually help your project succeed. Also help you create clear evaluation objectives. So these ideas of intended outcomes or indicators of success, which I'll talk about later, and how you can reach your goals. And also identify some of the challenges and make suggestions on how to overcome those. I'd just like to point out during the session, I'll be predominantly presenting, but just do ask that if you have any questions or concerns, please type them in the chat. Bruce will be monitoring that. So if there's anything that you need more clarification on, he'll flag it for me. Despite my background in attention research, the impacts will work through the website. Those links, which are that we'll spend some time discussing and creating your evaluation questions so that you can get started on that journey. We'll talk a little bit about what an evaluation plan should look like and involve, how to do some of the practical pieces, and then have some at the end for Q&A. But as I said, a small group to evaluate. So evaluation is helpful in making sure that if you think about evaluation as a way of getting feedback and to see what's working and what's not working, that's a really helpful framework to have in terms of figuring out how things are going. So it's one thing to create the resources, but if the resources don't actually help the students or there are some kind of issues with the resource, that would be helpful to know, before your funding is up or before you kind of, have this end product. So it's a way to kind of get these check-ins and get a sense of how things are working, what is and isn't working. So in these ways, evaluation can help you determine if the goals that you have, that you set out, are being met, figure out ways to improve your project design and implementation, and also make informed decisions. On top of just helping your project succeed, you also have to submit a project evaluation report at the end, or it's not a project evaluation, a closure report at the end, a component of which is project evaluation. So you will also need to say, what you did and what you learned from this experience in that report. Okay, so basically in the first half of today's session, we're going to be working through this evaluation cycle. And again, really want to highlight the idea that evaluation is a cycle, it's iterative. So even though you might feel like, oh, okay, I only have this funding for a small amount of time, it's helpful to go through this process, again, to get feedback from your students, from your peers, from your colleagues about what is and isn't working to better refine that end product and better reach your goal. Okay, so what we're going to start with today is defining your research question, figuring out what your practice is, what you'd like to evaluate, and what you hope to achieve, what your intended outcomes are. For all of you in today's sessions, this is, if any of you have held TLEF funding, I recognize many of your names. I think some of you have been involved in many different projects. You might have seen a version of this presentation before. But for the projects today, all of you are working on open access resource creation. So we're sort of narrowing our niche here in this presentation. So we know what you'd like to evaluate. I can answer that question for you. It's not an unknown. We're looking at the resource itself. So sort of, sometimes we call it the practice or the output. But the outcome is sort of what the impact that you're hoping that this practice or output will have. So as a result of creating this resource, what you hope will happen. And some examples are things like, higher student achievement, changes in motivation or attitude, increased awareness to diversity issues, and the list goes on. We'll talk a little bit more about these. But just something to have in mind is that, you're not just, the end goal isn't just to create this product. You want this product to have an impact, whether on students or your teaching team, the university at large, and that's something to think about. Okay, so I'm going to be working through this example that I developed. It's just an example. So again, these are pieces that you can kind of fill in. They reflect the questions that are on the worksheets that were provided. But the idea is that you can fill them in with your own specific examples. So again, working with the idea that the practice or the piece that you're developing is a resource. So in this example, if I have my own OER fund, I'd like to develop some open self-study, a self-study database for sections of Psych 217, which is a huge research methods course in the psychology department, which would benefit from some open access quizzes. So that would be my dream resource development. And what I'd like to happen as a result of this is to enhance student learning and knowledge. So student learning and knowledge are the intended outcomes. I want them to increase as a result of these resources. And we'll talk about the evaluation question in a little bit. But what I'd like to do next is just have you think about your own intended outcomes. And so take a look at this list here. This is something that I worked with Will to kind of curate some of the possibilities that we think, or that we've seen from things like the TLEF, or that we think are relevant to the OER projects that were funded in the past year. And so just take a look and see, which of these do you think apply to you? It's important that you think about these things now, because it'll be helpful in refining your evaluation question. So I'd like you to just take a minute and open those worksheets that I shared with you, and I'll share the link in the chat again, just in case anyone didn't get them or came in a little bit late. So with the worksheets, they are view only, so just make sure that you make a copy so that you're editing your own version, not a shared version for all of us to see. And just take a look at the worksheet and put a little check mark or a little X next to the ones the outcomes that you think are relevant to you in the chat, or jump on them and share an outcome that they have that's not on this list, or they have some confusion about how their outcome might fit into these different pieces. Just give you some time to share that with me. So I'm just seeing the question here. So we actually don't want you to edit the document itself because everyone will have access to the same one. So just ask that you download it or save a copy just in the file settings so that you can save your own version for you to use for your project. So I'm not hearing any questions or concerns. I'm not seeing any comments. So I'm just going to move on. again, this is a work in progress for you, so you might not have ideas yet for all of what your intended outcome or outcomes are. So then that's fine. Again, just something for you to think about, and just make sure that you clearly have them outlined as you move forward in the project, and we'll have a little bit more time to sort of workshop these ideas. So based on the example that I've shared with you all today, I'm going to build an evaluation question. And this is something that we're going to spend a little bit of time working on as a group and sharing our evaluation questions with each other, just because it's a really important part to start at and to make sure that you have a clear evaluation question going into your evaluation cycle. So based on the example that I worked with, so I want to develop some open self-study quiz databases for the Psych 217 course with the goal of increasing student learning and knowledge. And so my specific evaluation question would be, does adding self-study quizzes increase student knowledge of core concepts? And so what we're going to do is look at activity 2 in our evaluation questions. So what I'd like you to do is spend about 2 to 3 minutes thinking about your own evaluation question. So from the resource that you're planning or have already begun developing, what you hope will happen. So from that intended outcome list, which is also here, but also listed on that worksheet, build your evaluation question. So spend 2 to 3 minutes thinking about what this is. Type it into the activity 2 space on the worksheet. And then I'd also like you to type it into the chat. And then we'll spend about maybe 10 minutes sharing those with each other, asking questions, asking me for feedback, asking your peers for feedback, just getting a sense of whether that question is something that you can continue working with. Again, I know that this is sort of like you're just being presented with all this evaluation knowledge right now. And it's fine that your question might change over time, or you might have multiple questions. But I just like to start with 1 or 2 just to make sure that you have a clear example aside from the single one that I provided you, so that you can kind of think about this bigger picture and what your goals for this project are. So I'll give you let's say 4 minutes of quiet thinking time where you can use the worksheet to develop your question, and then ask that you spend 30 seconds to copy that question into the chat. And then again, I invite anyone to turn on their mic and ask a question or share their question, or if you don't feel comfortable typing a question about your question into the chat, and I'll just monitor those. So I'll just put the 4 minutes on the clock, and then I'll check back in with everyone. So I'm seeing some comments, and please feel free to continue working on these and sharing them. That's fantastic. So yeah, like Bruce pointed out, I love that Amy's question included a how. A flaw in mine, the example that I gave was that it's a simple yes/no question. So I could say, yes, adding self-study quizzes increases student knowledge of core concepts, but that doesn't really give you a lot of information. So adding that sort of why or how or why doesn't it is really useful. So yeah, that's a fantastic point. Thank you, Bruce, for highlighting that, and well done, Amy, in incorporating that in your question. And yeah, I think I appreciate how clear these questions are in terms of pulling out the intended outcomes. So I can see in her first question, this idea of awareness and capacity are the outcomes that she's hoping to achieve, specifically through this resource of the Open Wiki. And in question 2, the idea of use and access within the department. So again, another nice part about her question is that she focuses on the context in which it's happening. So yeah, those are fantastic questions, Amy. Thank you again for sharing them. So I just make sure these. Yeah, I know in talking with Will, the idea of cost is a big piece in OER resource development. So I know that's something a lot of people are focusing on, but figuring out how that will actually translate to your project, yeah, I think will depend on it. Yeah, the idea that students are using pirated copies, or I know some students just don't even buy a copy of the textbook at all. That can be a big issue. So yeah, it's fine to have questions even around open resource use. I know here I'm kind of giving a very specific context in my example, but it's fine to also just kind of get some questions out there about, like, how do they feel about the resource in general? How do they feel about open access resources? Yeah, Ignis, I think your question, just getting a sense of, did they use it? Or is it being used? I think sometimes we kind of go for these bigger impact, they've learned 40% more than they would have in another context. Sometimes they can't really answer those questions. It's hard to do that type of pre-post analysis in a classroom setting. So just understanding of, are they using it? That's a really good starting point. Awesome. Yeah, I'm looking at whether they would make use of it, if they, or what they would have done as an alternative. Okay, Simon's questions. Yeah. Okay. So Simon, I'm gonna pick on you a little bit. Just I worked with Simon previously on a project, so I feel like I can dissect his questions a little bit more. So just looking at your question, do students find the modules helpful? Helpful is a fine word to use, but you've clearly outlined these two intended outcomes. So building those, or incorporating those outcome words or language into your questions itself are helpful when you go to answer those questions. So I would say for that first question, you have, do students find the modules helpful in addition to their course material? Be specific in what you mean by helpful. So do the students find the modules increase their learning in addition to the course material? The modules are helpful in increasing their confidence? Do you find that the modules boost student feelings of retention? So building those intended outcomes into the questions themselves just make it a little bit stronger, a little bit easier to answer. Because you can imagine in a survey, if you just said, was this helpful? That's kind of broad. The student might say yes, but in which ways did they find it helpful?
Yeah. If I can jump in, I see, like, reading over my stuff, I see that there was also a bit of a disconnect between my intended outcomes and my evaluation questions, talking about, does student learning increase? So thinking very much in terms of do they retain more knowledge? Do they perform better on a test? But then seeing my evaluation questions where they've got a whole bunch of resources. And so did they use these resources? How often did they use these resources in comparison to a practice test that a professor might give or something like that? So I see that there's a bit of a disconnect between the two, but they're somewhat related in my mind. But that's very helpful feedback. Thank you, Trish.
Yeah, I think just clarifying that specification. And I think even like the questions that Agnes posed about whether they used the resource at all, or would they have purchased it, there might not be a clear intended outcome in that case. It's more like you want to gather knowledge about the use of the resource itself, and that's totally fine. I think just if you have a clear intended outcome, make sure that in one of your evaluation questions, that's being captured. Awesome. I'm seeing so many people are posting, and I'm being mindful of time, so I'm just going to read through them quickly and see if there's any other ones that I want to target a little bit more, or if there are any specific questions that I can answer.
Hi, Trish, if I may jump in and
Bruce, yeah.
with Chelsea and Simon, there was the timeline that they considered, and I really appreciated that because, for example, if they know in the course prior what was happening, and after the adoption of the new tools, how a student learning shift, then they have something that is more tangible. So it's good to kind of think about it as pre and post, but it's also, you could ask as students, comparing it then, with other courses, how did you feel? So you have a comparison that you put in, and a student can tell you some maybe qualitative feedback in relation to the other courses that maybe it's different from your course. So there are multiple ways to approach intended outcomes and evaluate the student experiences based on those.
Yeah, I agree completely, Bruce. I think, yeah, it's nice if you can do a comparison of what the standard is right now to what it is once the resource shifts. I just want to be mindful that I understand that this doesn't always work for everyone. You might not be able to do sort of a clean test that's sort of like, it could be an entirely new piece, or it's not really related to a course in specific. So I know sometimes people, they get hung up on these words of like research and evaluation, and they think like, oh, I need to do this clean, t-test comparison. Evaluation can happen without those kinds of, numerical processes. That's totally fine. Don't worry about that. Awesome. Great. Thank you again, everyone, for sharing them. I'm just trying to read through them quickly to see if there are any other specific questions. Again, yeah, I'm seeing a lot of people including a question sort of like, are students accessing the material? Who is accessing them? How are they accessing them? And that's absolutely fine. Like, you can think about an intended outcome as sort of usage in general. Like, how is the tool being used? Is it being used? Those are important pieces to evaluate, even before you go into details like, is it benefiting them in specific ways or in specific capacities? Because if they're not using the tool, then no, it's not going to be benefiting them. So sort of getting that first piece, that's really helpful, even if you're developing a tool in a course, for example, halfway through the term or shortly after you've introduced the resource, checking in and saying, how many of you are using this, doing a quick poll in a class. And then you can build on doing whatever type of evaluation technique, which we'll talk about shortly, you plan to do, focusing in on how it's being used and what is helpful or not helpful. So yeah, those first questions of, are they accessing it, are really important as well. Great, and see Chelsea was able to develop and deploy a survey before sharing the resource and after, so that's awesome. Fantastic. Okay, I'm going to move on and stop just sitting here reading your comments. If anyone has any questions or concerns that they want to jump in and ask, I'll leave a moment of silence here. Okay, I will move on. Oh, sorry, I'm just going to verbalize what Will's just shared, that there's some background information just on course material usage. So he's shared a great link there. So I invite you to check that out as well. Thank you, Will. Okay, so I'm going to move on further into the evaluation cycle. So now that you've defined your question, or that you've somewhat defined your question, we think about how you can measure that piece of measure that question. See if what you want to know is happening. So the first part of this is identifying indicators and then sorry, I had too much coffee today. Figurating is not a word. Figuring out how you will evaluate that. So again, in those worksheets, there's a whole page that has a big list of indicators that provide some information about different things you might want to measure. So in my example about whether adding open self-study quizzes increases knowledge of core concepts, my indicators might be specific performance on knowledge tests or student confidence. So those might be two kind of tangible pieces that I'm going to look for to answer my evaluation question. So knowledge is a very broad concept. in my specific example, I'm looking at performance as an indicator. You can certainly look at a number of other things like student perceptions of learning or judgments of learning. That the worksheet on activity 3 gives you a broad list of different ways you can measure different concepts. Those, again, are just some examples. So feel free to look at them and use them as they match your own project. And then the next piece, once you've figured out those specific indicators, it's to determine how you're going to evaluate them. So in the example of mine, looking at the performance, I'm going to be measuring performance via quizzes. So in this course that I'm hypothetically teaching, the students will do quizzes, and then I'll see how they perform and whether there's perhaps a change in a prior course that I taught. So their performance should go up. For student confidence, I might do something like survey the students or conduct focus groups. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about these evaluation techniques in just a minute. But again, I just invite you later on those worksheets and look at activity 3 to give yourself a sense of the broad ways that you can capture the pieces of your evaluation question. Today, I'm going to focus just on 4 very common evaluation methods that we often see in the projects that we support at CCLT. But I invite you to be creative in the ways that you do your evaluation. I'm going to talk about these 4 pieces. I'd also just like to invite you to go to the ISOTL website. So as Will mentioned, Bruce and I both sit on the research and evaluation team, and then also work as part of the Institute for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. So if you go to our UBC website, we have a number of resources around survey development, focus groups, and interviews that go into a lot more detail about how to do these things, as well as links to past presentations that we've given or workshops that we've given on these topics. And they're, I think helpful resources in beginning this process, specifically within education settings. So just some guidelines around working with students and things like that. Also, just remind you that Bruce and I are also here to help support your evaluation journey. So do please feel free to reach out to us if you want to get started on doing a focus group, but you really don't know where to begin. We can certainly help you with this process. So I'm just going to spend a few quick minutes talking about these methods, just to kind of give you an overview of the pros and cons of each of them. Again, it's really important that you figure out what you're measuring and what your question is before you decide what you're going to do. We see a lot of projects where people say, oh, I'm going to survey the students to find out their experiences. And we kind of have to take a step back and say, like, their experiences about what? What are the intended outcomes? What is the research question? Because those are really important to think about before you decide on the method that you're going to use, because each has their own pros and cons. Okay, so just looking at interviews and focus groups, these give you a more detailed understanding of an experience. So you have the chance to talk one-on-one or in a small group with a subset of participants. This way you can ask them questions and get really specific responses in the way that you might not be able to get from something like a survey, where you just provide them a question and they only have one question that they can answer. In something like an interview or focus group, the student or participant, faculty member, staff member, is able to sort of build off of an answer that they've given and provide, a narrative and more information. With a focus group, you have multiple people in a room or in a Zoom room, and they're able to sort of feed off of each other's experience as well. So you get much richer data. In terms of facilitating these, just some tips are to make sure that you have a protocol. It's easy to say, oh, I'll just have a quick conversation, but having specific questions that you've designed beforehand and making sure that you're sort of focusing on those, even though you do want to give participants the freedom to sort of elaborate and provide their experiences. Also having something to go back on to make sure that you're getting your research or evaluation questions answered is really important. Also make sure that you're recording the session or having a note taker transcribe the events that are taking place, because you won't be able to remember all of those rich quotes or pieces of information. Again, also making sure that you have student or faculty permission with all of these designs. Observations is another method that you might decide to pursue. We don't see as many people taking this route, but that's not as a false to it as a method. This gives you a really rich, quantifiable understanding of what's happening in a certain situation, typically in classrooms. So this would be the case where you would have someone come in as sort of an outsider and monitor the situation. And you get a sense of the types of interactions, the certain behaviors that are happening in that situation. It's really important that if you have multiple people involved in helping, that everyone agrees on how to code certain behaviors or the criteria for documenting different behaviors. You also want to, in that same vein, keep all of the information impartial. So make sure that people are sticking to protocol and following these sort of guidelines for when to record behaviors and what counts as a behavior or not, keeping it as sort of non-subjective as possible. And lastly, talking about surveys. With surveys, you get a much larger sample because you can sort of ask everyone or invite everyone to participate, which you can invite everyone to participate in a focus group, but you end up with quite a smaller subset of people actually participating. Surveys can also be helpful when comparing groups of participants. So I forget, someone mentioned in the chat that they were able to do a pre-assessment and then compare it to a later situation after they've had access to the resource. So surveys are helpful in getting that sort of pre-post situation. And it's also easy to integrate into classroom activities. So you could incorporate it as part of an assignment or as part of something that's happening in the classroom already. Something like a poll, if you're just wanting to get a sense of what's happening, capture what's happening in that moment. Some tips for surveys. There are a lot of tips for surveys. Surveys are sort of my area of expertise, and so it was hard for me to narrow this down to one slide. We have like a whole hour-and-a-half session that we usually present on this topic. So try to be concise. You want to keep it short. With surveys, it's easy to ask a lot of questions or to have a lot of questions that students, as I'm sure you're aware, especially right now, are being bombarded with surveys for all of their different experiences. And so focusing again on what your research question is and how you can answer it is really important. Focus on what is the outcome that you want from the question that you're asking. What answer would you want that would help answer, or what response would you want that would help answer that question? I always think about surveys, and I think about it in line with like writing a research paper. If you were writing the results section of a paper, what would you want to have in that area, and what questions do you need to ask to get that piece of information? With surveys, again, you're forcing students or staff or faculty to answer specific questions. You're not giving them a lot of freedom. And so make sure that the question that you're asking and the wording you're using is very clear. So ask someone else, a TA or a colleague, to review the survey and make sure that the wording is clear in terms of what you're asking. The question as well as the responses that you're giving them. Also make sure that you're keeping personal items optional. Again, on the iSOTL website, we have some guidelines on asking about demographics, gender, social, economic status, and items like that. If you do need to ask them, the best way, we provide some examples on the best way to ask those questions. And here at UBC, we use Qualtrics as our FIPPA compliant tool. So again, just making sure that any data that you're collecting is being stored securely. Okay, again, in looking at all of these research methods, first you want to kind of figure out what your question is, and then think about what the best way to answer it is. But just being mindful that different methods result in different sample sizes. So with something like focus groups or interviews, you're able to get really rich personal experiences, but you're limited to a small sample. Whereas with surveys, you get a much larger sample, but the data that you get isn't as rich or qualitatively focused. So just be mindful in that both methods have their pros and cons, and use the one that works best for you. Okay, so just want to go for some sort of best practices in evaluation design, sort of some tips and tricks that we've come across. So again, remembering what the specific evaluation question is that you're trying to answer. Only ask for information that you need to answer that question. It's easy to kind of get carried away and think about, what could you ask? You can ask a lot of things, but what should you ask? What will actually help answer those questions? And so again, just really trying to hit home the importance of having clear evaluation questions before getting into this process. Also being mindful of whether participants will be able to recall the information that you're asking them about. So, when possible, doing something like a pre-post survey is fantastic, or, if they're able to just reflect back, last semester. But if you're saying, these are first year or final year students and you're asking them to think back to their first year, they might not have, as solid memories as you'd like about those experiences. So just consider when you should be asking students for feedback, specifically, when will they remember or be able to kind of reflect on those experiences. Again, just regardless of the method that you're using, piloting the questions that you're going to be asking, and just having someone else to review those for you, trying to reduce jargon, identifying any items that are perhaps double-barreled, so asking, if yes, then explain this answer, but if no, then explain this answer. Having those as two separate questions so that it's not as confusing. Okay, again, just kind of wrapping up this evaluation cycle, the final two steps, just focusing on that idea of preparing and piloting. I know sometimes people say like, it's the end of semester, I just need to get this survey out. But having data that isn't useful is not useful. So just making sure that those questions are really clear and that you spend some time thinking through what the answers are that you would like to get before you waste students' time, waste your faculty team's time, and waste your own time. And then collect your data, analyze your data, and start that cycle all over again. I'm mindful of time because we're getting near the end here and I have a little bit more to discuss. So I'm just going to leave this slide for you to review later. This is just an example from Christina Hendricks, our own CTLT director, with an open evaluation project that she conducted and then wrote about. I encourage you to read the paper. It just has a really nice framework for the research questions that they developed their project. So just invite you to use it as an example if it's helpful, aside from the one that I already provided, to get a sense of, in the real world, a real world example of open education evaluation. And Will has so kindly linked the paper here, thank you, or in the chat. Okay, so just wrapping up, looking at your practical plan. So now that you've decided what your research or evaluation question is and you know how you're going to go about it, you've done all of those pieces, how to put this into action. The most important piece here is establishing a timeline with milestones. And so activity 4, the final activity on that worksheet that I provided, gives you a nice layout for setting this up. Just helping you figure out who is doing what, who will be administering the survey, who will be running the focus group. What do you need to do to prepare those activities for happening? It's really easy to kind of say, oh, I'll do that next semester. And then, as I'm sure you all know, next semester comes and goes very quickly. And so having these milestones in place, you can kind of work with them to make sure that you're prepared for when you need to actually do your evaluation. Just some final pieces to consider as you present necessarily make it an evaluation question. And again, with regards to piloting, just because you understand a question doesn't mean that your participants will understand what that question means. some other considerations in terms of integrating evaluation into your course. So whether you want to just get kind of one snapshot so that, at the end of the term, ask the students to participate in a focus group and get feedback then, or if possible, doing things like comparing different cohorts of participants, so over time, or some sort of pre-post analysis. Also just being mindful of the flow of the project. So what is the best time to administer a survey or to conduct a focus group? Probably not when students are doing, their final exam review. And who, in terms of cost, who can help you? Can you hire an RA to help with facilitation, things like that? Finally, a very important part that I'm just going to whirlwind past is considering whether you need BREV approval. Most evaluation projects that we see don't need to go through BREV approval because you're doing something that we like to call quality assurance. So you're kind of implementing a practice into the classroom to see how the student experience happens. But I really invite you to go through the PDF listed here. It gives you sort of just whether your project would perhaps need to go through the Behavioral Research Ethics Board review process. So just be mindful of that as you're doing your work. Okay, just about ready to wrap up. So one final slide that I want to share with you is I took these revised from the TLEF closure reports, which I review, as examples that people provided for evidence of evaluation. And so I just want to be clear again, both in terms of the value of evaluation for your own project and making sure your project succeeds, but also in terms of reporting. So a formal closure report that you'll have to share with us once your project finishes, but also in any type of presentation that you might do on this work or that you might share with someone, being clear on the specific practice or output that was achieved and what the outcome of it was. So I've just provided these examples here and clearly listed, what the practice was, the development of an open textbook, and what the outcome that was from that result. Something that I sadly see a lot of in the TLEF reports that I read are statements like, we conducted surveys to see if students were satisfied. That doesn't give me any evidence of whether students were satisfied or not, or sort of, what did you learn from this whole experience? That's sort of what we want at the end of the day with evaluation is, what do you know now that you didn't know before? And how can that continue to inform your practice? So explaining how the impacts were measured, what you did, and what the outcome was. Those are really important pieces. And speaking of what evidence should look like, I want to share this evaluation page. I'm just going to post the link here, which just shows the OER Fund completion report. So I'm going to actually hold that thought. I want to talk about that, or we'll talk about that in just 1 minute. And I just want to wrap up my presentation. So we'll leave some time for questions in a moment, but I just want to, again, let everyone know that Bruce and I are here to help support you. There's a small number of in-kind hours that we can provide for evaluation support for your OER project. So if you'd like to meet with one of us one-on-one to chat a little bit more about your questions, or to get some feedback on the design plan you have, or to get a little bit more support with whatever you're doing, please do feel free to reach out to us. We're here and happy to help.